We're here for our Exodus Bible study, and I'm excited for us to explore this book of the Bible. It is my favorite book of the Bible, and I love it because it really highlights the transformation of Moses. And so, what we enjoy here in this study is the exploration of a lot of rich story. Um, a lot of complexity of content and different ways of highlighting it. It holds the Ten Commandments, it holds the Ten Plagues. There's just a lot of story. And let us begin with a word of prayer before we dive too deep into it. Gracious God, we just give you thanks for the blessing of this day. We seek your presence with us as we explore this great book. We ask that you would give us wisdom and understanding as we approach it. Amen. So, what are some of the things that you think of when you think of the book of Exodus? Uh huh. Right. Right. Yeah, right. There's a lot of connections to the New Testament. Yes. That's right. That's right. One of our key points we're going to examine that's a goal for this class is to discover why the book of Exodus is a foundational text for the rest of the Old Testament and informs the New Testament. And as we go through, we're going to see a lot of connections to the New Testament, which just stirs our imagination and intertwines it in a way that adds a lot of depth of meaning. Um, a lot of people explore the depths of this book, and we'll be covering over the next several weeks. And it's an exciting thing to offer it here, to offer this recording to those out in the digital world, and what a great opportunity it is for us. Um, Right off the bat, the book of Exodus is really composed of four main themes: liberation, law, covenant, and presence. Liberation, law, covenant, and presence. It highlights the liberation of the Israelite people from the oppression of the Egyptians and the Pharaoh. You see that grand arc of the story as they escape the slavery they're in. We get the law. We get the law of God as shared in the commandments and the rest of the laws there at Mount Sinai. We have an establishment and a renewal of the covenant between God and the people of Israel. And then it also highlights the presence of God with God's people, and that God has not left the people of Israel. So, as we entertain that, and some of those are highlights from a scholar named Walter Brueggemann. He's probably the most important Old Testament Hebrew Bible scholar of the last 100 years, and he has shared some of those tidbits. Um, Here's some little bit of context for this book of the Bible. It's thought that this book was finally written, like its final form, in the time after the exile of Israel, which was basically kind of in the 500s. That's the 6th century before Christ. It could be in the exile time or the post-exile time. And why that's important is those that are writing down what has been passed down through oral history, they are writing these events of God, but they also bring with it their current circumstances. So, as they have currently gone through their own oppression from an enemy, or have just escaped that oppression, that adds a lot to thinking of their ancestors who experienced the same kind of pain. And so those things link together. We kind of share that the events of the book of Exodus take place in the 1400 BCE, before Christ, before the Common Era, the 13th century. So there's a lot of history between Exodus and the exile and post-exilic period. And so those things kind of link together. Any other comments or questions about some of those facts and figures? Okay. Obviously, the book of Exodus is a continuation of the story in the Bible. Obviously, Genesis is our first book of the Pentateuch, and basically Exodus is continuing the story of God's relationship with the people of Israel. You'll remember that there was a covenant established with Abraham, and then reestablished with Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, and there's the 12 tribes of Israel with the 12 brothers. And now we are continuing with what happened in a couple generations after those events have taken place. So what we can think about is that this book highlights transformation. This book highlights transformation of the person of Moses, from a leader who murders, runs away, doubts himself, struggles with leadership, but gets to be transformed to the person that gets to stand on Mount Sinai with God and even convince God to keep a covenant with Israel. And we're going to get into that into a later study session. It's also the transformation of Israel from an enslaved people to a free people, and a free people who choose to obediently serve someone else. Slavery is obviously imposed upon someone. And then they will be transformed into people that humble themselves and willingly submit to God, who has given them freedom. So let's dive in. Can I have someone that would read verses 1 through 7 of chapter 1? Okay. Very good. Thank you, Betty. As you can see, these verses are setting into context those that are reading this book. In those days, genealogy was everything, connection with your family, and it is to us too, but to the extent that they would remember down the lines for such a long period of time, that was a sacred thing to them to remember and maintain those names. Here you see that they're highlighting the connection to the generations that come after Abraham and the children of Jacob and all these that create the 12 tribes of Israel. It also gives a little context of what has happened in between the time of Joseph's death and now. The Israelites have been fruitful and prolific. They as a nation and as a peoples has bursted at the seams. There's a lot more of them. They multiplied and they filled the land. And basically, this sums up that they've got to kind of fast forward because the nation of Israel was just a handful of people. And now we haven't realized, well, this is a full-blown people that are living in this land. How about we read verses 8 through 14? Okay. Thank you very much. What are a couple of things that jumped out to you about what the writer is describing there? Okay, the Egyptians became afraid, or at least the people in power were afraid. We see the king is worried that they're going to become a threat down the road, and they just keep populating, and they oppress, and then they populate more, and so they are they're convinced that they have to do other things to ensure that they don't cause trouble. And one of those is obviously to impose a harsh life of slavery, field labor, and they became ruthless. And, you know, sometimes when the people in power communicate these ideas, that can filter into their own people. And so it may be that a lot of the Egyptians look down upon the Israelites as less than. They are serving them, and so that creates a separation. And you can see that there's going to be a tension that's built there. Let me read through the end of this chapter. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him, but if it is a girl, she shall live. But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them. Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live. So this is pretty intense, and you see this king, this Pharaoh, resort to some extraordinary means in order to limit the amount of people that are Hebrew. Um, it's interesting that in this first chapter, um, the cunning and powerful people are the midwives, um, and they are able to outwit the Pharaoh by sharing such a funny statement. Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, so they're putting down the Egyptian women, right? For they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So they are so strong, so quick with childbirth that we can't even get over there to help them. You see this repeated every so often, that the people multiplied and became strong. So that's trying to share that the people of Israel is growing, growing, and growing. So it's to signal to us that there truly is a nation brewing beneath this oppressive regime of the Egyptians. And so, Betty, you alluded to the New Testament. So, what to you in this story connects to the New Testament? Of the killing of the boys. Right, right, right. Okay. But you. Right, right. So when Herod, yeah, and that's very intentional of the writer of Matthew to pull in the story of Moses. The writer of Matthew tries to mirror a lot of the similarities, and one of them is the death of the innocents and Herod seeking the elimination of. I have to clarify if it's all children or all boys, but all boys two and under. Um, and so that signals to us this connection here. And both are evil dictators, both are horrible, and both do not fulfill their mission. There's a way in which Moses is able to escape through kind of the reeds, and there's a way that Jesus escapes. Um, and the thing about this is that Pharaoh doesn't know that God is going to use someone to free the people. He has a national concern, but his concern um, isn't about a specific person, right? But God choosing Moses to do this activity of leading is one of the main instruments that leads to that happening. One of the interesting things, in addition to Shipra and Puah kind of being more cunning and outwitting of the Pharaoh, is that you may be wondering, well, are there only two midwives in all of this time? And some people believe that Shipra and Puah are symbolic of larger groups of midwives, and that it's possible that these bands of midwives are rebelling against this order from the Pharaoh. And right, right. Right, and that's the interesting thing is that he's trying to have them do the opposite of what they're supposed to do. And mhm. Well, the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, and so it's kind of interesting, um, them threatening. Um, right, right, yes, yes, and that shows the arrogance of the king, thinking that the the people he's oppressing, that they're just gonna do as he says, even if he's asking something horrible. Um, and God is glad that the midwives seek a way out of carry, seek a way out of not having to carry out this horror. Um, and the other thing is that in each occurrence, the Pharaoh is placing the burden in other people's hands, right? So he's placing the burden on the midwives, and then what does he do at the end? He says to all of his people, "Every boy that is born of the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile." So he's placing even more burden on everybody. If you see a young Hebrew boy, throw him in. I mean, that's just kind of washing his hands, that he's not the one getting his hands dirty, right? Um, any questions about that chapter? Okay. On to chapter 2. Would someone read the first 4 verses? Okay. So they get right to the point of what needs to happen. Um, they don't fawn over. I mean, they spend one verse that there's these two people that get together, right? There's another verse. Well, that woman has a son, and that she has hid him. Now, can you imagine hiding a baby for 3 months and just hoping and praying that and it's just natural. The baby's going to cry. The baby's going to get hungry and shout. And the wisdom of the mother says that I cannot keep this up too much longer, because what's the baby going to start doing? The baby's going to start crawling. The baby's going to start walking. The baby's going to start running. And the older the child gets, the harder to hide. Um, and that we can only imagine the turmoil of that decision. Um, and we're going to get into this a little bit later as we look at the Red Sea. But the translation of the Red Sea is actually the Sea of Reeds, or the Reed Sea. So it's not that the sea is red, but that the sea is filled with reeds. And so here you see an illusion of what's going to happen and several chapters later, Moses is already delivered through the reeds of the sea, because the mother placed the child in the river in the reeds on the bank. And so that's foretelling of what is to come from being saved through the parting of the waters. I'm going to read the next several verses to connect this. The daughter of Pharaoh came to bathe at the river, while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. This must be one of the Hebrews' children, she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Yes. So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed it. The child grew up. She brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. So there's a lot of little connecting points here that can sometimes be confusing in what is going on. And there could be a couple theories. It could be that the mother of Moses placed the baby in the river, hoping that someone would find it and care for it, or would not, not be a threat to the child. There's also a thought that the mother perhaps knew that the daughter of Pharaoh was a nice woman. It seems like Moses' sister, which is Miriam, knows the Pharaoh's daughter, because there's this interaction. Maybe they know that if they can kind of let her see him, that there's a chance that there'll be some mercy there. But basically the connecting dots here is the mother of Moses puts the baby in the water. Pharaoh's daughter finds the baby. And then Moses' sister comes along and is asked by Pharaoh's daughter to go find someone to nurse this baby. And so obviously the sister goes and finds Moses' mother, brings her in, and not only that, but now she's going to get paid to be his own mother. So it's kind of an interesting twist, and there's a little bit of a trickster element here of the mother and the sister working together to help Moses be saved through this means. Any thoughts on what you've thought about that story? Uh-huh. Right. Mm-hmm. That's right. And it should be said here that Moses is saved by 5 women: the midwives, um, his mother, his sister, and Pharaoh's daughter. And so all of those women. So it's interesting that if you remember at the start of this, Pharaoh was adamant about getting rid of all the boys. And here are all these women who are really the ones that are in a position to help and save and bring about rescue for Moses and assumingly others. Um, uh-huh. Right. It seems to be that way. It seems to be that she's the nanny and Pharaoh's daughter is raising him as her own. Kind of like, um, right, right. So apparently, and I don't think we don't hear like this conversation, Moses, I'm your real mom, but um, we can read into it and like, yeah, I mean, they must have told him, and it's also one of those things where a 3 month old, even though they're young, they're still going to recognize their mama. Um, yeah, the voice and um, the skin to skin. Um, so all that is important. And I do know, obviously, she puts him in the river when he's 3 months old. Um, and so it's uncertain of you know, the age of the. Right. Well, it certainly seems like they sent him down and then she walked out and, oh my goodness, he wasn't sitting in the river for a couple days. I don't think that's what. Uh huh. Yeah, I feel like it's got to be a strategic thing, a plan. Um, and every plan that they're going to do in this environment is risky, but it's also even more risky to just keep them as it is. So that tells you that there's a lot of desperation in these people. They're strong, they're enduring. So let's continue on in our reading. Yeah, please. I know. And isn't it funny that all the women are doing the work and where'd that Levite man go? Right, right. Okay. Let's see. Karen? Would you read um, 11 through 14? Well, this is a big turn and twist. Um, I mean, what do y'all think? Why do you think Moses reacts this way? Oh. Uh-huh. Right. Yeah. I think what it gets to is there's some confusion about who Moses is. Um, right. Yeah. Because you know, if you put two and two together, I mean, basically, he's related to the Pharaoh or raised in Pharaoh's house. There's not a lot of details about those things. You know, if you've seen the Prince of Egypt or any of those Exodus movies, they fill in a lot of gaps that aren't necessarily there in the story. Um, but, you know, Moses is really caught in an interesting position. He's basically a foreigner, and we're going to talk about this when we get to the Midian part, but he's a foreigner to three different groups of people. He's a foreigner to his own people because he's raised in Pharaoh's house or by Pharaoh's daughter. Um, he's a foreigner to the Hebrews. Well, I just said that. But he's a foreigner to the Egyptians because he's not an Egyptian and he's raised, you know, by his mother. And then when he runs away to Midian, he's really a foreigner because he doesn't even know these people. So very much Moses is kind of a lonely ship here. And so there's clearly some tension. I think also we fill in the gaps and assume that Moses, from his position, has seen a lot of oppression, and maybe that's been bottling up and it just blows up. And then when he's accused, he flees. So that's an interesting way to do it. He doesn't try and seek out where his mom is. He doesn't go talk to Pharaoh's daughter, who's kind of been his mom. He just runs away. And so that changes some things. Let me read the rest of, or the next several verses. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh. He settled in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. The priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water and filled the troughs to water the father's flock. But some shepherds came and drove them away. Moses got up and came to their defense and watered their flock. When they returned to their father, Reuel, he said, "How is it that you have come back so soon today?" They said, "An Egyptian helped us against the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Where is he? Why did you leave the man? Invite him to break bread." Moses agreed to stay with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah in marriage. She bore a son, and he named him Gershom, for he said, "I have been an alien residing in a foreign land." So lots of things have happened very quickly. Moses has fled to the land of Midian, which is east of Egypt. And you see here that Moses helps these daughters of the priest. You'll see this name, this is Moses' father-in-law, change. Sometimes it's Reuel, sometimes it's Jethro, and a couple other books of the Bible, it's Hobab. And but they all mean the same person. And as kind of like, it seems like this marriage is more done in gratitude, which sometimes happened in those days. I guess the priest of Midian thinks Moses is pretty honorable and a good man, so he gives Zipporah to Moses in marriage. And then they're together. They have a son. They name him Gershom. So we're already getting that there's some time that's fast forwarding, right? And as I spoke about Moses being a foreigner to three different groups, he names his own son as symbolically as that. Any thoughts about those events? How many of you knew Moses was married and had a son? Yeah, we just miss those details sometimes. Right, I don't think so either. I think you're right. Usually left out. It's just kind of complicated. Right. We certainly don't hear a lot about them. Okay, these last three verses of this chapter are very important. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of the slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. This selection of verses is kind of a marking in the road that separates the previous two, and then we're on to God's interaction. Because up until this point, God hasn't been involved, at least written into the story. There's two or three examples of where God is mentioned, but there's no communication from God. There's no story involving God. And so we have all of this story that's built up. Moses has been saved. He grew up. He murdered. He fled. He married. He has a son. The Israelites are groaning under slavery, and now God is here. It's kind of an interesting way in which it's written, because what it seems to suggest is that up until this point, God wasn't paying attention, or God wasn't hearing. But I think that the purpose of the writer saying God heard their groaning and God remembered is to say that these people, as you've heard on and on, they've multiplied, they've gotten stronger. They've multiplied, they've gotten stronger. And now there's so much of them, and their strength is now at a tipping point of being squashed. So their cries for help reach the ears of God, and now God wants to purposefully intervene. So there are different ways to look into that. If God was just convinced to come on and help, if God had a perfect timing moment, that this was when everything was going to start changing. But what it establishes is that God is going to reclaim this covenant that's kind of been squashed because of the Egyptians oppressing the people that God is in covenant with. I think it also is a connecting piece that Moses is now in a position where there is going to be able to have change come about, because Moses is the person to do that. Any questions about that? Does that shock you, kind of the reading of that? Right. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. And that's a good point to bring out, because as we remember and reflect about when this is finally being written down, they themselves have been oppressed, so they're processing. When there are crises that happen, say the pandemic, some of the questions people say is, "Where is God?" Right? Or you can think of all the crises throughout the past 100 years. Those questions have come up when there's war or whatever. And so perhaps this is just a natural way of them expressing that pain. I will say that there are 4 verbs in this selection of verses that are important. I get this from Walter Brueggemann again, and he says, God heard, God remembered, God saw, and God knew, as in God knew them. So those are all activities, and so God's activity is now going to be focused upon the Israelites' freedom. God heard, God remembered, God saw, God knew. When's the time that you have cried out to God, or when you have felt God heard you? More than one time, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Um, what does it feel like when you know God has heard you? Calming, comforting. Uh-huh. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Yes. Absolutely. I think we can all be assured that God does hear us. We can be assured that God does hear us, that God responds to us, that God sees us and God knows us, and that God is not a fan of oppression and wants to intervene in that. And um, what we will see is that God will be using the person of Moses and also Aaron to bring about this freedom. So God just doesn't come in and um, declare from the heavens. God utilizes people to do it, and people that have flaws and are um, human just like us. So that should give us a little pause about what we feel God may be calling us to do, and um, to be listening for when God calls us to do great things. I thank you all for being here. It's been a great time of discussion. I hope this has been fruitful, and we'll continue in this. Um, Kind of the first week is you kind of, just charge through, but since we're going to be doing this weekly, go ahead and read before class if you have the opportunity, chapter 3 and 4. And if you have questions or whatever, you can also bring those ahead of time. So I thank you for that. Let us close with prayer. Gracious God, be with us as we go out into the world. May you equip us with ears to hear, eyes to see, to remember your promise, and to know that you're with us. Amen.